Kellen Ward's breath rasped inside a fogging helmet as he fought the wind's knife edge. The crash had wrenched the spine from his courier shuttle. The sled of wreckage still burned somewhere behind him, a smear of molten orange under a sky the color of iron. The suit HUD blinked red across his visor. Thermal core, 9%. He could feel the cold sawing into the joints of his fingers even through the gloves, feel it flowing up his legs, until his stride was a stutter. He'd walked blind for an hour across a world of white and roar. No landmark, no horizon, just snow churned to smoke by winds that came in fists. When the light appeared, he almost missed it. A pinprick, then a thread, then a soft, stubborn ember that refused the storm. Kellen angled toward it, boots skidding on glassy crust, and came up against a half-buried structure, rock buttressed with plates of rust red alloy, and a single rectangular door framed by hoarfrost filigree. Warmth leaked from a seam. He pounded his fist once, twice. The wind took his voice and mangled it. With no reply, he clawed the manual lever until the mechanism broke free and the door slid open on a groan. Heat rolled over him, honest, living heat carrying the smell of char and something resinous. He stumbled inside, sealed the door, and slumped against it. "Stop there!" The voice came from the gloom by the fire pit, low, edged, absolutely certain. Kellen froze, his visor clearing. She stood with one hand on a spear of black metal, the other braced on a knee. She was tall and lithe, wrapped in patchwork snowcloth and dark leather. Her ears, triangular, furred, the bright rufous of a Telari fox, tilted toward him. Orange fur marked her forearms in sleek bands. The same burnished color framed a face that was otherwise human fine. High cheekbones, a narrow nose, eyes a molten amber that picked up the coal's light and made it their own. "I didn't invite you," she said. Kellen put both gloved hands up, palms out. "Then I owe you an apology and about 2 hours of your heat." She watched him sniffly, and he understood the calculation. Stranger, threat, burden. The spear's tip hovered steady, a breath from his throat. "My name's Kellen," he said, careful. "My ship jumped short. I walked. If I go back out, I'll die." A long beat. The wind battered the walls. Finally, she tipped the spear upright, its butt clicking against stone. "Corner. By the brazier. Do not touch anything that looks older than the sky." "I don't know what that means." "Good. Keep it that way." He edged toward the fire and dropped to a crouch. The heat punched into his bones so fast it hurt. He forced his gloves off, flexing tingling fingers. When he looked up, she was still studying him, alert, unreadable, the way a predator studies a noise in the grass. "Thanks," he said. "Don't thank me." A flick of one ear. Yet. The shelter was a mosaic of eras. Kellen saw hand-cut stone mortared with ice slurry, modern cargo plates riveted along stress lines, and at the core a ring of glossy, almost glassy black, alien manufacture, seamless, cold as thought. Above the pit, a tripod held a kettle that hissed and breathed resin steam. Racks of bone, handled tools, and spools of wire hung beside neat stacks of rations stamped with unknown sigils. She moved around him without hurry, feeding split driftwood and chunks of polymer to the coals. Up close, the details sharpened, the soft guard hairs along her jawline catching in burlight, the faint peppering of white along one ear's edge. A scar there, a bite once taken and survived. Her tail, full, brushy, orange shot with deeper rust, was wrapped like a scarf around her hips for warmth. "Name?" she asked again, like a customs officer double-checking a manifest. "Kellen Ward." "Ward," she repeated, tasting the consonants. "I'm Lixa Kest." "Lixa," he said, filing the sound. "You live here." "Obviously." "For how long?" "Long enough to know the snow by taste." She angled the spear toward the door and the thin leak of daylight at its edges. "And long enough to know that Storm is not a guest. It is the landlord." The kettle squealed. She poured a viscous amber into a stone cup and set it by his knee. Sip, Burns at first, heals after. He took a mouthful, gagged, and then decided he was, in fact, alive. It tasted like pine resin, smoke, and lemon pith. Warmth bloomed in his throat and spread outward in stubborn rings. "You said older than the sky," Kellen said when his voice returned. "You mean this ring?" Lix's glance flicked to the black band around the pit. "I mean this entire hill. The ground here hums if you put your cheek to it. There are bones under us that are not bones. You step on the wrong plate, the hill remembers your weight and tells something that is also older than the sky." "My beacon's burning," he said. "Shot the distress on impact. The relay in this sector is supposed to be dead," Lixa said. "Or listening for prayers it never answers. Doesn't matter which." Kellen studied her. "You don't like people." "I love people," she said blandly, "when they're distant and hypothetical. The nearer kind is complicated." "And me." "Your weather," she said, those amber eyes pinning him. "I dress for you, and I wait you out." He managed a laugh. It came out raw. Fair. He didn't stop shaking. The resin tea helped, the brazier helped, but cold had threaded itself into him with careful hands. The suit's core limped from 9% to 8%, then blinked to 7% and stabilized there from sheer stubbornness. Lixa watched him, ears flattening slightly. "You'll stalemate yourself into a coma." "I've had worse nights," Kellen said. "Not here," she said. "And not with the drifters waking." "Drifters?" Her nose wrinkled as she listened to the wind. "Things the snow wears to walk. They sense heat through a skin of ice and forget their names when they're hungry. They're quieter than you think." "That's not comforting." "It's not meant to be," she said, and then sighed, a small irritated sound like a match refusing to catch. "You're human, yes? You run hot on the inside, poorly on the outside." "True enough. My people learned different. We were born under 2 suns and winters that lasted half a year. We carry our summer inside the bone." She rose, crossed the room in 3 quick steps, and knelt in front of him. Up close, the amber light kindled copper in her eyes. "You will die if your core drops 2 more points. I'm working on not doing that." "I am too," she said, and before he could shape a question she unhooked the catches at her collar and loosened the insulated wrap layered under her leather. Heat spilled out of her like the open door had. Clean, fierce, almost living. Not just body heat. Something deeper, a regulated blaze under the skin. She gripped his sleeves. "Lie down." "Lixa, I. Down." He lay. She threw a tapestry of stitched hides over them and slid in against him. Her fur brushed his jaw, soft, warm, faintly scented of resin and steel. The heat was immediate and astonishing, flooding across his ribs like sunlight under a shutter. He hissed through his teeth. "This is biology," she said into his collar. "Not a proposition." "I gathered," he said, and then, because words made it easier not to think about the thundering of his heart, "You radiate like a furnace." Her mouth quirked. "A controlled burn. You'd last the night on the floor. You'll last till morning like this. And after morning. Then we discuss your usefulness. Is that my rent?" "Yes." He shut his eyes. The wind pressed palms against the walls. Somewhere below them, the stone hummed, slow, patient. Lixa's breath slowed, warmed his throat. When he finally slept, he dreamt of standing in shallow water under green auroras while something vast turned in the dark beneath the ice. He woke to silence, and the sight of Lixa's tail draped shamelessly across his chest like a banner. She wasn't there. Heat lingered where she had been. He pushed himself upright and saw the door was open a hair, the storm a pale howl beyond. "Lixa?" he called, throat rough. "Quiet," came her whisper from outside. "They're curious." Kellen grabbed a thermal hide and edged the door wider. The world beyond was a lesson in white, but different now that he listened the way she had taught him without words. The wind screamed. Yes, but under it was a new rhythm, heavy and testing. He stepped out beside her. Shapes moved within the blowing light, 3, 4, slow and deliberate, as if the storm had grown bones. When one paced sidewise, the others echoed it, keeping the shelter at a perfect triangulation. Kellen felt his neck hairs rise. "Drifters," he said. Lixa nodded once, spear low. "They map heat. They don't see us. They taste us." The nearest shadow edged closer. It was enormous, 16 hands at the shoulder if it had shoulders. Frost scaled its flanks in plates. Its front was a mask of old ice that had been melted and refrozen so often it looked hammered. Inside that mask ran faint threads of light, like trapped lightning. "What's the plan?" Kellen said. "Begin with not dying." Her ears canted. "And do exactly as I say." The nearest drifter lunged, silent until it hit the snow, then explosive, a rolling avalanche of claws and plated ice. Lixa met it in 2 strides, planted one boot, and moved. A coil, a bright unfurl, the spear snapping up in a short arc that caught the mask at its thinnest crescent. The ice spider webbed. The thing shrieked without breath. Kellen threw himself sideways as a second drifter. A comet of orange cut the edge of his vision. Lixa crashed into the second drifter, claws punching into ice with a sound like knuckles on windowpane. She tore a seam, heat shivering the fracture, and the mask sloughed in a gleaming peel. The thing beneath wasn't flesh. It was frost foam wrapped around a lattice of dark rods, and in the heart of that lattice something small and black flickered like a failing star. "Cores," she yelled. "Crush them. They teach the others." He didn't argue. He jammed the shovel's edge down at that flicker and put his weight on it until the metal rang. The light went out. The drifter collapsed in a heap of glazing and dust. Across the drift, Lixa vaulted, landed on the first, and wrenched. It shuddered and lay still. The third watched, learning. It backed a pace, then paced forward again on a slightly different line, testing. Lixa's ears flattened. "Inside," she said. "We can fight." We did. Now we make the story it tells its friends as short as possible. They backed toward the door. The drifter came on to a threshold only it could feel. It halted. That was, Kellen realized, the most frightening thing of all, that something so huge could be patient. It watched them vanish into the warm dark and stayed a long while after the door had shut. They braced the door. Lixa's tail lashed once, irritated, her breaths fogged in quick bursts before the brazier reclaimed the room. She stalked to a rough-hewn shelf, pulled down a tin, and tossed Kellen a strip of salted meat. He caught it clumsily. "You don't take trophies," he said, chewing. "From the drifters." "Memory is a trophy," she said. "I prefer mine clean." He sat, the shovel across his knees. "You said cores teach." They speak to each other, sparks sharing a story. Break them before the story spreads, and this hill remains a rumor. Kellen nodded. "And the rent?" "3 things," she said without hesitation. "You fix anything with wires. You carry anything that bruises my shoulders. And when I say down, you acquaint yourself with the floor." "Reasonable," he said. "I can also fix radios, jury-rig thrusters, and swear in 5 languages." "4 too many," she muttered, but her mouth tilted in amusement. They ate. The wind tried the walls and failed. Heat drew fog from Kellen's sleeves in long curls. The bones of the hill hummed. Kellen felt it again, that low note under the world, as if the stone chewed slowly on old light. "What is this place?" he asked. "Really?" Lixa's gaze moved to the black ring around the fire. "A mouth," she said. "Part of a larger throat. There are vents in the valley that breathe like sleepers. There is a cave where the ice is so clear you can read your heartbeat in it. Underneath all of that, a machine bigger than stories. And you live here because you like the view. I live here because the ones who exiled me would rather I be a cold lesson," she said lightly, but her ears were still. "And because the machine is not done speaking." Kellen let that sit. What did you do? Lixa poked the fire. Sparks rose, sparked in her eyes, died. I corrected someone with a louder name than mine. She shrugged, a one-shouldered, oddly elegant motion. The correction was unwelcome. You were right? Yes, she said. And so here we are. He leaned back against the stone, feeling the thrum in his spine. Then we make a different correction. Lixa's ears tipped toward him. Meaning? Meaning we fix truth to something louder than exile. He tapped the black ring with a knuckle. If there's a machine down there, it has a voice. Maybe it can sponsor an argument. You're a courier, she said. You deliver irony? Messages, he said. But I've smuggled stranger things. Lixa watched him for a few beats, tail slowing, eyes narrowed in a way that meant calculation rather than distrust. Eat, she said finally. Then sleep. Tomorrow we test how much of your bravado is insulation. Morning arrived as a thinning in the wind and a sky that glowed amber through the smoke hole. The temperature crawled from murderous to merely cruel. Lixa kicked Kellen's boot. Up. He grunted into his sleeve. Do you have coffee? I have a responsibility to not poison guests, she said, handing him more resin tea. They dressed for the white. Lixa's winter gear had been authored by necessity, seal-stitched fabric over plates of tempered bark and alloy, all of it quiet, all of it designed to shed the kind of snow that stuck and drank your heat. She tossed him a second scarf. Your neck whistles. Outside, the world wore knives. The valley below the hill unfurled in folded sheets of wind-carved snow, dunes and cornices and razors. Kellen saw structures snagged in the drifts. Half a mast. He listened. The gusts came like surf, which meant there were lulls if you timed them. They moved then, low and stubborn, like animals with a mission. Lixa set a pace that made Kellen's calves heat and his grief about his shuttle become something useful. He saw her at work, how she read eddies, how her ears turned independently to gauge what the wind carried, how the pads of her fingers tested the crust and found purchase where his boots slid. They reached a ridge of glassy blue. Lixa held up a hand. Second lesson, silence. When the snow stops talking, something else is speaking. They listened. The world quieted, and under that quiet, Kellen heard a mechanical rhythm distant and clean. Not drifters, not wind. Something like a fan blade turning in perfect circles deep underground. Lixa nodded toward a line of small stone cairns, each capped with a triangular shard of black glass. Third lesson, she said. We leave breadcrumbs the storm cannot eat. Kellen grinned. Fourth lesson? That shovel, she said, deadpan. Keep it. It has opinions. They pushed on. The ridge broke into a pocketed plain where steam ghosted up from cracks. Lixa crouched and tapped a frost-rimmed pipe that poked from the snow like a fossil. The machine breathes here. Feel? Kellen knelt and put his palm to the pipe. Warmth seeped into his skin, carrying a tremble like subsonic speech. He swallowed. You weren't kidding. I have little time for kidding, she said. I save it for when someone trips. They worked through the morning, harvesting ragged panels from an old antenna stack and hauling them to a wind-hollowed dip where Lixa had half a dozen contraptions in varying states of half-finished genius. Kellen's hands remembered old joys. Solder's bitter scent, the neat click of a connector biting home, the way a panel woke and gave you numbers like an animal nosing your palm. By midday they had a dish slung between two scavenged spars and pointed at a patch of sky where the sector relay ought to be sulking. Kellen thumbed a switch. The set hummed. A graph crawled. Noise, he said, but it's noise with teeth. Lixa shaded her eyes and watched the graph like a hunter watches a tree line. Bite back. He grinned. With pleasure. Static is a kind of weather. It has textures. It wears masks. Kellen sorted through it the way he'd learned to read the body language of officious portmasters, ignore the waving hands, and watch the feet. A narrow ridge of signal kept repeating just below the noise floor, too regular to be nothing, too shy to be helpful. He modulated the dish, sketched out an audio range sweep, and sent 3 pings, One human standard, one wideband chirp, one stupid. A melody no machine would recognize unless it had ever overheard a dock worker singing under his breath. The second came back smeared. The first didn't come back at all. The third came back late, bent, and oddly cleaner. Lixa gave him a sideways look. You flirted with the sky. It flirted back, he said, badly. He cleaned the return, carved out its spine, and stretched it until it became a phrase. Lixa cocked her head. A child learning a language someone has been trying to unteach it. Or a relay with a hole in its brain, Kellen said. Either way, it's listening to something else when it should be listening to us. He tried a different approach, leaning the dish's beam down along the valley, past the hum, toward the breathy vents. The return came up sharp enough to make the needle jitter. The machine under the ice had opinions about their pings. It answered in a rhythm that made his ribs ache. Lixa crouched beside the receiver, ears pricked. I've heard that cadence in my sleep. I heard it in my dreams last night, Kellen said. You dream loudly. Only when freezing, he said, and then frowned at the board as the rhythm stuttered. The graph blinked from clean to dirty and back, like clouds dragging claws across the sun. What is that? Lixa asked. Kellen was already pivoting the dish. Up, he said. Not down. The noise wall tore open. A new signal flooded the band, chirpy, ratcheting, bureaucratically excited. Lixa's lips peeled off her teeth. Salvagers. You get many? Kellen said, fingers flipping switches on reflex. Enough to know their boots are heavier than their hearts, Lixa said. They never come alone, and they always bring a permit that means nothing at the temperature we live at. He scanned, found the source. 3 flyers arrayed high, triangular against the blank. Their signatures sprayed challenge pings over the valley like birdshot. The machine under the ice went quiet as a held breath. Lixa's tail lashed. Inside, she said. We make choices with doors between us and greed. By the time they... Lixa drank another resin mouthful and wiped her mouth with the back of a hand. Options. Talk, Kellen offered, and then, at her look, joking. Good, she said, because they don't. He paced the narrow room until the pacing could become thinking. If they're sector chartered, they'll claim emergency salvage even if they saw my beacon. If they saw yours, they'll call you a hazard and tack a surcharge on compassion. We can't outrun flyers on foot. We can't outshoot them with a spear and a shovel. We can outlast, Lixa said. Storm is louder than greed. But not forever. They'll drop drones, sniffers, Kellen said. Thermal. Acoustic. Smart enough to label us. Stupid enough to get sentimental about their own safety. Lixa's ears tipped. Sentimental? They evaluate risk. If we raise it above a threshold, they sulk. Teach me how to make them sulk. He grinned despite himself. With pleasure. The first drone arrived like a gray pine cone drifting along the wall of wind. It searched in fans, its little eye goggled and glee-red. Kellen waited until it crossed the pit smoke hole and flicked on a coil he'd wired into the ring. Just a stolen battery, a repurposed transducer, and a prayer. The coil spat a pulse that made his teeth sing. The drone bucked like a horse that had seen its shadow and spun end over end into the snow. The flyer chirped confusion. The coil hummed down. Again, Lixa said. Satisfaction like a second fire. 2 more times before the battery sours, Kellen said. Then we need a better trick. They got the second. The third hung back and mapped the swirl of their interference like it was tracing a child's smile, then climbed out of range and called home. The flyer spread. Lixa swore softly in a language that felt like winter storms. What will they do? She asked. Kellen listened to the Doppler whine. Land, he said. Parties with guns come later. First come the talkers. Lixa's tail twitched an elegant, disdainful arabesque. I don't talk. Then you watch, Kellen said. And you heat the air if I fall down. The knock at the door wasn't a knock. It was a chirp, old standard hailing packet sent through the seam. Kellen cracked the hatch to a hand's width and met a helmet's visor with his own. The face behind it was lean and sunburnt, the eyes professionally friendly. "Afternoon," said the salvager on a radio. "You're trespassing inside a sovereign permit." "Afternoon," Kellen said, equally genial. "You're trespassing inside my crash radius." The man laughed as if they'd met at a dockside bar. "We'll be taking a look at the artifacts in this grid. If you vacate and sign the incident waiver, we can credit your account for surrender of claim." "Tempting," Kellen said. "But I'm warming up." "And harboring a class unknown," the man added, head tilting to see past him into the gloom. "That complicates your liability." Lixa moved in the shadows. Her eyes were twin vowels of fire. Kellen stood just enough in the gap to make his shoulders look like the only occupants of the room. "Do you know what this hill is?" he asked softly. "Machinery," said the salvager with the disease of certainty. "We have a legal right." "You have a right to die polite," Kellen said. "Because if you open the wrong plate, the hill will remember your fingerprints and tell the rest of itself where to find your bones." The man's smile chipped around the edges. "Is that a threat?" "That's a weather report," Kellen said, and closed the hatch. Lixa's exhale was a small, delighted sound. "You lied to him," she said. "I told him the most interesting truth we have," he said. "Now we buy time. Salvagers don't like weather they can't invoice." The flyers pulled back and began laying out a perimeter of upright rods that sang at a frequency just wrong enough to itch. Kellen felt the ring under the floor respond, a growl waking at the bottom of the world. "Can we speak to it?" he asked. "The machine." Lixa's ears tipped to the floor. "It speaks to anyone who steps exactly here," she said, crossing and planting her heel on a flagstone whose surface shone a shade darker than the rest. "But not with words you and I share." "Show me," he said. She bared a sliver of teeth, warning or smile, impossible to tell, and touched the stone with the pad of her finger. The room changed. The fire receded, the cold slowed, the sound of the wind died as if someone had smothered it with a heavy cloth. Kellen felt pressure on his eardrums from inside out. Images are a kind of grammar. He saw a coastline in winter, black stone standing out of green water. He saw a wheel turning under ice. He saw a map of this valley as it had been before the first storm, brown earth, grass like wire, bones of towers, then the slow snowfall that never stopped. "Maintenance," Kellen said, the same way a starving man says bread. He hauled his gear over and sketched schematics on the floor with a bit of charcoal. "If we can give it a patch, something small, it might give us a door. Or a scream. Either helps." Lixa crouched, tail curled over her boots, and watched his hands move. "You think you can fix a hill." "I think a hill wants to be heard," he said. "And I know how to make stubborn things listen when they're lonely." Outside, the salvagers argued with their own signals. One rod flickered and began to sing the wrong note. The others corrected, drifted, corrected again. Lixa's ears swiveled. Irritation made graceful. "We have until they tire of patience." "Then we go down now," Kellen said, pointing to a seam he'd noticed in the black ring, a subtle discontinuity, a place where the light failed differently than it should. Lixa followed his finger. Then her mouth curved, pleased and dangerous. "You have a good courier's eye," she said. "I get paid to see doors that pretend to be walls," he said. She rose, took the spear, and with the steel butt rapped the seam 3 times in a rhythm that matched the coil of the machine's dream. The ring shivered. A notch slipped, then rotated. The fire didn't gutter. It shifted, as if the air around it had merely decided to rearrange its own molecules. Steps revealed themselves in what had been a flat floor. "After you," Lixa said. "Ladies first," Kellen said. "You're the one who owes heat," she countered, eyes glinting. He grinned, his own breath suddenly fogging for entirely new reasons, and started down into the throat of the hill. The steps were narrow, the shaft absolute black, but the walls radiated a chill that wasn't cold so much as memory. Lixa followed close, her presence a band of warmth along his back. They descended 10 meters, 15, before the shaft opened into a chamber whose ceiling was a mirror of winter sky. Frost stars webbed the surface in 6-pointed geometry, their centers pulsing faintly, dimmed heartbeats of an animal conserving itself. At the chamber's core stood a pillar of that same glass-black material. It was not dead. It was simply waiting. "Say hello," Lixa whispered. Kellen set the panel bundle down and opened the case with the tenderness he reserved for machines that wanted to be treated like living things. He spiraled out antennas, linked a coil, opened a throat mic, and chose a voice. Not his, not human standard, but a measured rise and fall he'd extracted from the relay's ghost language. Then he spoke into the pillar with that voice, one phrase repeated 3 times, the way you greet a shy dog. The pillar woke. Light moved through it like mercury learning to stand. The chamber air warmed by a degree, then 2. The frost stars brightened, and their points relaxed, like clenched hands. Lix's ears went forward so sharply they seemed to cut the air. "You charmed it," she breathed. "I apologized," Kellen said, "and asked for a map." The pillar gave them one, the valley as a skeleton, the vents as lungs, the relay as a rusty tooth in the jaw of the sky, and 3 new things he hadn't expected. One was an access artery that ran under the salvagers' grid and came up like a well beside their perimeter. One was a glyph he didn't recognize spinning slowly over a point beyond the ridge. The third was a line back into the shaft they'd used, annotated with a pulse that felt almost like humor. "What does that mean?" he asked. Lixa's grin showed more teeth. "It means the hill is amused. We found the older door instead of the easy one." "Where's the easy one?" She pointed to the well, then to the floor under their own feet. "We are clever," she said, "but sometimes clever is simply stubborn in a good pair of boots." He logged the map into his set, thumbed a thank you, and watched the pillar settle into a steady glow that made the chamber feel briefly like a temple. Under the salvager's grid, rods continued to sing wrong, right. Above them, the flyers shifted, irritated in their orbits. Lixa leaned her shoulder against his. "What now, courier?" "Now," he said, tasting the shape of their chances in his mouth like a piece of fruit whose skin would not decide whether to be bitter or sweet, "we give the hill a small repair. Then we ask it to speak louder than permits." The hail came again as a chirp through seam and stone, but the voice that followed was new, older, roughened by recycled air and arguments won on technicalities. "Shelter occupants. This is Captain Mara Osk, charter holder for Grid 7 Kappa. Acknowledge. You've interfered with survey operations," she continued. "Our safety systems flagged irregularities consistent with sabotage. We are logging this. The storm breaks within 6 hours. We will descend. If you cooperate, your liability exposure is minimal. If you don't, salvage law permits neutralization of hazards." Lixa's ears ticked toward the hatch. She talks like she bites forks to test their metal. Kellen smiled without warmth. "Captain Paper Crown," he murmured. "All filings. No spine." "Spine snap?" Lixa said. "We hunt under the nerves." He laid both palms on the pillar. "We need a favor," he told the hill. "We need a hush." The pillar pulsed once, and Kellen felt like the memory of rain, a pattern impressed on his palms, a sequence, a rhythm not unlike the one Lixa had used to call the stair, but longer, more intricate. He memorized it the way you memorize the order of stars so you can find your way home drunk. "An ancient please be quiet," he said. A hush protocol. Lixa's grin was all canines. "Teach me." He tapped the sequence across her fingers. 3 touches, pause. 5 faster, hold. A long press like leaning an ear to a door. She repeated it perfect. "Good," he said. "When they drop sniffers, we bite their ears shut." Above, Captain Osk's voice softened by half a decibel. "You are within an artifact. These structures are sector property. The charter predates your birth." Kellen lifted his head, thumbed the seam radio without climbing. "Captain?" he said. Do your filings include a clause about notifying indigents? Indigents? The previously and currently living, he said. Tone still cordial. There is a resident. You'll need to fill out Form 77A to request mercy. A pause. When Osk spoke again, there was metal under the words. You and your class unknown will vacate. Captain, he said quietly, palm on dark glass. The hill is listening. Lixa didn't like being underground when other boots walked the snow above. Her tail twitched in narrowing arcs. Her ears read the world like Braille. We should be sky-side, she whispered. I hunt better where breath plumes. And give our noses to their rods? Kellen shook his head. Down here, their toys think we're rumors. She set her palm to the pillar. Hush? Hush, he agreed. They climbed. At the top of the throat, the seam was a tone darker, the ring a shade warmer, the brazier's breath steeper. Kellen cracked the hatch. The storm had thinned into ropes. Light unspooled in an icy blue. The salvagers had set 3 tents with snow skirting and hard points hammered into old stone. Rods ringed the hill, each capped with a dish that shivered like a wet dog shaking itself dry. A drone waddled toward the smoke hole with an attitude that said, I have paperwork. Lixa tapped the rhythm against the black ring. The drone sighed, went slack, and sank into the snow as if forgetting it had ever been a drone. Its dish drooped like a flower that had decided to dislike the sun. On the ridge, a flyer's belly light winked twice. Annoyance, then calculation. Again, Kellen said. She hushed 2 more. A 4th hung back, humming. The rods altered their note, creeping higher until the air itself felt brittle. Out by the tents, 3 figures in olive parkas conferred. One stood very still, arms folded. Captain Osk. She removed her helmet. Her hair was iron gray braided tight to the skull, her face a map of all the cold she'd ever endured because she'd chosen profits over warmth. Her eyes, that was the part Kellen filed. Not cruel, exactly, but edited. She'd cut out things that got in the way. 2 hours, Osk said into the general. Then we open them. If they come out, we log human remains and a feral. If they don't, we pour fire. Lixa's ears flattened. Pour fire? Thermite slurry, Kellen said softly. It eats secrets faster than lawyers do. Then we take her toys, Lixa said, and showed her teeth. War on a hill with 3 rooms is the art of edges. Kellen mapped every seam with his palm, every place where a hidden plate changed temperature when you whispered to it. Lixa paced the perimeter and read the snow's faint signatures like a book whose words rearranged themselves to suit the reader. Between them a plan formed, not clever for its own sake, but sharp where it had to be. First slice, Kellen said, laying wire along the black ring. We make the rods sing harmony. Not their song. Ours. Lixa watched his hands, memorized. Second slice? We give their tent fans a cough. They'll open their visors to complain. He pointed at a slit in the rock just above the drift shelf the salvagers were using as a dining ledge. Third slice is a mirror. Lixa's tail curled at the tip, amused. Lixa stood on her toes to peer through a finger-wide crack. Osk was still there, talking with a woman whose coat was too new and whose hands were very clean. The woman gestured a rectangle with her fingers, impatient. Osk did not look. She leaned into the wind as if agreeing with it. Captain Paper Crown has an assistant with soft palms, Lixa murmured. Backer, Kellen guessed. Or an auditor. What's an auditor? A predator that eats numbers, he said. They lose their teeth in the cold. Lixa grinned. Good. They worked. Kellen's fingers were sure. Lixa's speed made the hands of a clock look drunk. When the set hummed, the hill hummed back, low, approving. At Kellen's cue, Lixa tapped the hush sequence on a new plate, one lower on the ring than the last. Outside, 3 rods went out like candles pinched between wet fingers. Osk's head lifted. On guard, she said on the open band. Someone is poking the bear. Lixa rolled her eyes. She has never hunted bears. Or hills, Kellen said. Osk approached the hill alone, a courtesy or a flex. Her assistant called after her, "Captain, the liability models." But Osk ghosts didn't wear leashes. She stopped 5 paces from the door and planted her boots like stakes. Occupants. Kellen opened the hatch a handspan. Cold knifed in. He met her stare over the split. "Captain." "We'll be entering," she said. "Stand clear." "There is an indigent resident," he said pleasantly. "Your permit lacks a clause to justify evicting the weather. Is she a registered citizen?" Osk's eyes moved past him, quick. Calculation. Risks. The ghost of caution. "She's alive," Kellen said. "That used to be enough." "For saints," Osk said. "We are contractors." "On a hill with a mouth." Her jaw tightened. "I've dug my share of mouths." "Have you asked any to speak?" "Machines don't talk." Her gaze flicked to the ring, and for a fraction of a second something like hunger cracked through. Real, bright, ungoverned. Then the shutters closed. 2 hours, she said again, and walked back into the blue. Kellen shut the hatch. Lixa leaned her shoulder to his. "She wants to hear it." "She wants to own it," he said. "Not the same." Lixa's ears made a small shrug. Sometimes prey invents names for the teeth that will chew it. It is still chewed. The first thermite tube came in on a sled, 5 drones tugging it like obedient huskies. Kellen let them 15 meters, 10, 5, then raised the coil and sang them a note ripened on the pillar's breath. One drone coughed, lost its will to be a drone, and took a nap. The sled jerked. The others fought. Lixa exhaled, satisfied, and tapped the hush again. 3, 5, hold. The second and third drones forgot their jobs. The tube broke its tether and slid sideways into a drift. Thermite doesn't care what it burns so long as it gets to decide. Snow hissed, then hardened to a glassy skin. Red smoke wrote a curse in the air. "Now," Kellen said. Lixa sprang. She was orange and winter and arithmetic, the kind of arithmetic that gives the right answer with claws. She vaulted the drift, landed on the sled, and with the butt of her spear peeled the feed hoses off the tube 1, 2, 3. A drone woke, decided to be brave, and buzzed her head. She swatted it so gently it forgot to be brittle. The assistant with soft hands shrieked and dove for shelter. Osk didn't move. She watched Lixa the way some people watch weather maps, the kind of attention that respects the possibility of being wrong. Lixa landed beside the tube, swept its nose away from the ring, and rapped it. Once, exactly, and the hush went into the metal. Kellen saw it, actually saw it, a ripple like heat. The thermite blinked, reconsidered its happiness, and went limp. Osk swore very softly, not at Lixa, at herself. They trained between the interruptions because training is what a body does when it is preparing to fight without dying. Lixa taught Kellen how to lean into a shove without leaving his center behind, how to make the shovel a lever instead of a club, how to listen to the wind with his skin. Again, she said, and he did, and again, and he did. A dozen times until the motion lived in his bones instead of his head. They drank resin tea. They traded professions like stories at a fireside. He learned enough Telari to ask, "Do you trust me?" and to answer, in the way that matters. Z learned enough dockyard slang to call him a hard-luck courier with a star for a compass, and no sense of when to shut up. "You're Exile," he said quietly when the brazier was low. "Tell me the part that matters." Lixa's ears smoothed. "A winter ended early," she said. "It was my doing. The elders liked their calendar better than the sun. I picked the sun. Elders dislike correction. They exiled the most useful person in the room," he said, not as flattery, but as a fact. The relay in the sky wanted to listen. The hill's pillar wanted to be heard. Between those desires stretched a web of charters like fishing nets hung between cliffs. Kellen hated nets that caught voices. "Time to talk loudly," he said. He rewired the dish to ride the hush frequency as carrier, tucked the pillar's heartbeat under it like a patron saint, and laced his own words between. He didn't broadcast on human standard. He used the relay's crooked language, the one that had come back bent and cleaner. And he didn't call for his own rescue. He called for witness. "This is Grid 7 Kappa," his voice said in a rhythm old machines recognize. "Artifact awake. Sector charter violation in progress. Indigent present. Salvage action risks structural compromise. Elevate. Elevate." Lixa's fur rose on her arms. "We get gods? We get auditors with colder hands," he said. "But they carry paperwork that can swat a captain." He hit send. The dish sang. The pillar thrummed approval. Above, the flyers hiccuped. Osk looked up sharply. Her assistant grabbed at her sleeve. "Captain, that traffic?" "Is a trick," Osk said, but she was not certain. "Shut it down." They tried. The rod screamed. The third drone learned to hum at a frequency that made Kellen's teeth sing off beat. Lixa hushed it. Osk's crew rolled a second thermite tube. Kellen fed the pillar's breath into the hush until the air itself softened at the edges. The broadcast climbed, and was heard. It didn't happen like a trumpet. It happened like a cloud changing color. The relay's ground note shifted the way a ship shifts when heat blooms in a boiler. Then came a rim chime that said recording. Then a second that said admin. Osk's assistant made a noise like ice cracking. Osk, to her credit, put her glove on the assistant's wrist and anchored her in place. "Sector Oversight Vessel Roanoke," said a voice on a band so old Kellen could taste the dust in it. "Grid 7 Kappa identify." Osk's jaw worked. She keyed her mic. "Roanoke, this is Captain Mara Osk, Charter 751 Delta. We are conducting authorized survey." "Authorization flagged," the voice said in a tone that made even Lixa's ears bend. "Indigent presence logged. Stall?" The assistant hissed. "We can fight this." "We can't fight gravity," Osk murmured, soft enough that only the wind and Kellen heard. "Roanoke, request guidance. Cease all penetrative operations. Maintain perimeter. Do not engage occupant. Oversight arrival in." A pause so microscopic only a machine could have measured it. 12 hours. 12 hours is a lifetime when you're cold and hunted. It's also a blink when you're sitting on something older than myths. Osk straightened. Acknowledged. She looked straight at the hatch then, as if she could see through it and the ring and the years, and Kellen did something he hadn't expected of himself. He touched his brow in salute. Osk didn't return it, but she didn't look away. "Not done," Lixa said, listening to the valley. "They will test the fence." "They?" Kellen asked, though he knew. She nodded at the drift line where the world graduated from white to something like a bad memory. The drifters came without ceremony. 3 at first, then 5, then 7. Their masks were different. Thicker, scored, freshly grown over old cuts. They shuffled forward, learned the rod's song, stepped back, advanced again on a slightly different cadence. Kellen saw it the same moment she did. The rod's frequency had taught them. They were building a harmony to match. "Clever snow," he breathed. "Hungry snow," Lixa said. "Will the hush quiet them?" "Maybe," Kellen said. "But we can't hush a blizzard and a bureaucracy at once forever." Lixa took his arm, brief, fierce. Then we cut sharper. "What do you need from me?" "Your shovel," she said, and grinned like a fox in a henhouse. They went out at twilight when the sky turned the color of a bruise and the valley's breath fogged up from the vents in ghostly rivers. The drifters had settled into a semicircle and were testing the perimeter with the patience of saints. Osk's flyers circled higher, unwilling to bring their bellies low. Lixa stepped into the snow and became a new geometry, angles that didn't add up until they did. "Aim for the seams," she said, and Kellen repeated it as doctrine. Their masks grow thick where they remember pain. So we give them new pain somewhere else. She moved so the drifter saw one shape, then another, then forgot both. Kellen crept opposite her and found a drifter's flank. When it lunged, he pivoted and put the shovel's edge into the soft junction of mask and chest. The blade bit and rang. Again, Lixa said. Lixa took 2 more in a long, tidy dance. She didn't linger on pain or grace. She corrected mistakes with the exact pressure required and no more. Osk's crew watched from the line, silent. The assistant's face was chalk. Osk's hand sat quiet on her rifle, not raising it, not lowering it either. When the last drifter backed off, leaving a crescent of glittering debris, Lixa walked to the edge of the line and put her spear butt in the snow. She met Osk's gaze across the bright cold. "You don't control this valley," Lixa said. "You negotiate with it." Osk's expression didn't change. "And you?" Lixa's tail flicked. "I speak the language your rods haven't learned yet." 2 hours remained on the Roanoke clock when Osk came to the hatch again. She didn't bring her assistant. She left her rifle at the line. Kellen opened the seam. They stood with a width of wind between them and acted like that wasn't the most honest third party in attendance. "Your broadcast," Osk said, not wasting throat. "That will cost me." "It will cost you less than Thermite would have," Kellen said, "and you get credit for preventing your own worst instincts." She almost smiled. "I don't get credit for restraint, only for tonnage." "You'll get credit for survival," Lixa said, stepping into view. Osk's attention clicked to her with the clean apportionment of a slide rule. "You're the indigent," the captain said. "I'm the resident," Lixa corrected. "I have names in the snow this hill remembers when it melts. What does your permit remember when it burns?" Osk's nostrils flared. "You have a gift for the dramatic." "No," Lixa said. "I have a gift for winter." A long beat. Osk's shoulders softened by a sliver. "I have a crew. I have contracts. I have a ship that eats fuel so fast I feel poorer each time I breathe. I won't be the villain in your story, resident." "Then don't be," Kellen said simply. "Be the hinge instead." Her eyes narrowed. "Hinge?" "Turn at the right pressure," Lixa said. "Open the right door. Our oversight friend will want a villain. Give them a story where you are the solution they can file." Osk stared at them, reading the air, the ring, the way the valley held its breath. She nodded once, sharp. 12 hours, she said. "I'll keep my people from doing something stupid. You keep the valley from doing the same." Lixa's mouth twitched. "Deal." The Roanoke announced itself with a pinpoint sun and the kind of authority that makes permits wish they were prayers. It slid into the weather without ruffling a flake. It didn't shout. It simply existed. The relay sang greeting like a dog seeing an old friend. The ship's envoy came down on a tethered sled, a woman in a matte black pressure coat with the posture of a blade in a sheath. Her badge read M. Han, and her eyes were the color of distant rain. "Occupants?" she said at the hatch, voice magnified by the kind of tech that made Kellen's palms itch with admiration. "Identify." "Kellen Ward," he said. "Courier." "Lixa Kest," Lixa said. "Resident." "Resident," Han repeated and made the word formal. She looked past them into the ring's glow, felt the hum in her bones, and inclined her head to the pillar's breath as if greeting an elder. "Artifact." It was the first time anyone outside this hill had said that word correctly. Osk stood under the envoy's shadow, her crew at half attention, her assistant eroded to a chalk outline at the edge of the scene. Han's gaze touched Osk and moved on without judgment. "We have records of your broadcasts," she said to Kellen, "and of 3 unauthorized thermite deployments. We have logged drifter aggression and hush operations. We have a question." "Only one?" Kellen said. Han didn't smile, but one corner of her mouth admitted the possibility. "The question is this," Han said. "Do you intend to claim stewardship?" Lixa went still. Kellen heard the word land in his own chest like a tool set onto a workbench where it belonged. "Stewardship," he said, "not ownership." "Ownership of a star's paradox is nonsense," Han said. "Stewardship is contained nonsense. We can file that." Lixa exhaled. "Yes," she said. "We claim what we already do." Han nodded, and the valley seemed to nod with her. "Very well," she said. Then we will convene a hearing in situ. Captain Osk will present. You will present. The Hill will present. The Hill? Osk said before she could help herself. Han's head tilted the smallest degree. It speaks, Captain. Try to listen. They held the hearing with the wind as clerk and the rods as skeptical jurors. Han stood with her boots in the drift and her coat open a finger width at the neck, as if cold were a hobby she no longer pursued but respected in others. Osk presented the charter, the tonnage target. Han listened. She did not perform listening. She did it. When she asked the Hill to speak, Lixa tapped the stone and Kellen lent his coil a breath, and the pillar sent up images, the vents as lungs, the rods as barbed wire on a bird cage, the thermite as an ulcer, Osk as a person-shaped pressure, Lixa as a line of warmth through 5 winters, Kellen as a new hinge the door had not expected but found useful. Osk's mouth thinned, then loosened. She looked at the thermite tube she'd ordered and saw what it would have done. She looked at Lixa and saw what she was. She looked at Kellen and saw a man who'd built a lever out of words because his hands trusted metal and truth in the same measure. Han looked at the assistant with soft hands. You are? The assistant's voice shook. Felon Ark. Contract auditor, Delta Logistics. Miss Ark? Han said mildly. You will need warmer gloves. When it ended, it felt less like a verdict and more like weather changing. Han spoke last. Stewardship granted, provisional to Lixa Kest, resident. Co-steward authority to Kellen Ward, courier. Captain Osk's charter amended. Survey authority at perimeter. No penetrative operations. Maintenance support mandated. All parties will submit quarterly reports. This valley will not be scooped. It will be learned. Osk shut her eyes just long enough to lay down a different war in herself. When she opened them, something in her gaze had unknotted. She stuck out her hand, not to Han, not to the pillar, but to Lixa. Lixa looked at the hand as if it were an animal that might bite. Then she shook it. Hinge, she said simply. Osk huffed a breath that might, in some kinder season, have been a laugh. Door, she said back. The Roanoke left the next morning with a wake of paperwork crisp enough to cut fruit on. Osk's crew rolled up their rods and learned to plant different poles, weather stations, low-impact arrays. Felon Ark requisitioned gloves and watched Lixa move with the expression of a person realizing that not all predators are on the opposite team. Kellen and Lixa descended into the hill with coils and wire and resin tea. They followed the pillar's humor to the easy door, then laughed until they had to sit because of how simple it was. A plate disguised as shadow, a seam disguised as a seam. We would have found it eventually, Kellen said. After inventing 3 worse doors, Lixa tapped the plate fondly. We earned the right to laugh at ourselves. They mapped the arteries, noted where stone was older than ice, where ice remembered spring. Lixa told the hill stories in tailory about summers that tasted like burnt sugar and the way night smells when rain finally comes. Kellen told it dock gossip and songs sung off key. Sometimes the pillar answered with pictures, sometimes with a weight in the chest that felt like gratitude. At twilight, they stood on the hill's lip and watched drifters skirt the new weather stations like deer circling a fence they decided to pretend was a river. Osk joined them, hands bare to the cold. I've never been a hinge, she said quietly. Feels like being a bruise with responsibilities. Lixa's ear flicked. You will heal into a scar you can use. Osk's mouth turned up. I'll write that in the quarterly report. Kellen learned the hill's night language. The way snow talks when it's building a skin. The way the vents sigh when they plan mischief. The way Lixa's breathing slows when she actually sleeps. He learned the hush sequence in his bones like an old prayer and invented a second one that soothed rods that hummed themselves into bad moods. He wrote labels on coils like they were old friends. He stopped dreaming of green auroras and started dreaming of blue ones that hung like veils over a mouth speaking math. Lixa refined him the way winter refines a traveler. She cut from his movements what he didn't need and left what he did sharpened to a point. She told him little things about her exile and large things about her people's love for serious jokes. He told her about ports that smell like cinnamon and rust. and about a grandmother who had taught him to bargain with the weather because bargains keep the gods amused. Sometimes, lying under hides with the brazier banked to a heartbeat, they talked about stewardship like it was a beast they shared, how to feed it, how to keep its fur from matting, how to understand when it wanted to run. They did not pretend it made them saints. It made them responsible. On the 41st day, Kellen woke to a sound he didn't have a word for. He lay still and let it educate him. It was small, stubborn, and wet. He shoved the hatch. He did. The sound came again, a soft crackling. The sun had bitten the ice's edge. The vent's breath smelled faintly mineral, and faintly like rain, imagined by a child who had never seen it. Down in a fold of drift, a mat of gray-brown, something peeked through. Lichen, waking into its oldest job. Lixa's tail brushed his wrist. The hill remembers spring. He laughed, sudden and bright. Write that in the quarterly report. I will, she said gravely. In capital letters? Messages went out and came in. Kellen received a terse note from a dispatcher who had thought him dead and had, he suspected, already spent his hazard insurance in their head. Return cargo unsalvageable. Courier account under review. He laughed and forwarded Han's stewardship docket. The reply was a string of punctuation that could have been curses or applause. Either fed him. Lixa received nothing because there was no one to send it. One night, without asking, Kellen composed a letter addressed to a council that had exiled her. Resident Lixa Kest, steward, winter's corrector, requests nothing from you and offers everything you refuse to learn. He didn't send it. He read it aloud with the brazier low. Lixa listened and blinked once, slow. Keep it, she said, for the day you need to remind me who I am. He tucked it under the coil's case like a charm. The pillars' maps changed as they learned. It showed them a bone under the ice that wasn't bone. A long cylinder canted like a tooth broken and left for ants to clean. They took a sled and went by lamplight, past the vents, past the ridges, into a hollow where the wind circled but didn't land. The bone rose out of the drift like a half-sunken mast. Its skin was etched with the kind of lines you only make when you're carving for the sheer joy of seeing a pattern repeat. Lixa brushed snow away, fingertips reverent. This is older than the hill. Kellen hummed. An ancestor, then. They found a seam, found a symbol half-worn, the same glyph the pillar had spun over the map in their first descent. Lixa pressed her thumb there, and the bone remembered being asked to open by someone with her heat and her stubbornness. It sighed. A plate slid. Inside lay a cavity filled with lapstrake shelves, each holding a small black stone. Cores. Drifter hearts. Thousands. The hill didn't grow them, Kellen whispered. It harvests them. Lixa's breath fogged, and teaches them. He looked at the shelves and felt a very old story shift in his head. Predators and prey and teachers and students, the roles moving in a circle like Aurora. We need a bigger report page. Lixa nodded, and warmer gloves. Oz came down to help move the panels they'd need to study the bone without making it angry. She carried one end without complaint and listened without editorializing. At the cavity's lip she stopped, eyes widening just enough to register the way a story rewrites the chapter before it. I wanted to melt this, she said, simply. We all want to melt something when we're cold, Lixa said. We learn to warm instead. Oz grunted. That going in the report too? Yes, Lixa said. At the top. Osk looked at the shelves full of cores. Those will make someone rich if we don't keep them where they belong. Kellen nodded. Then we belong here more stubbornly than greed knows how to be. Osk reached out. Not to touch. She'd learned that, but to feel the air just above a stone. Teach me the hush, she said. Lixa took her hand and tapped the rhythm into the old scavenger's palm. 3, 5, hold. Osk listened. She learned. She smiled, small and sharp. Hinge, she said. Door, Lixa echoed. On a night when the stars were knives and the aurora hung like slow curtains, they sealed the hatch and went down to the pillar to ask it a different question. Kellen placed his hands as he had before. Lixa set her palm beside his. "What are you?" he asked, not demanding, not begging, something between prayer and curiosity, the kind of tone you reserve for a friend who has never told you their middle name. The pillar answered in pictures too large for their skulls and small enough for their ribs. It showed them rivers braided under ice, pipes not pipes, lungs not lungs, a mind that was not a mind so much as a promise. Carry. Remember. Correct. It had been built to hold climate steady when two suns decided to quarrel. It had learned to negotiate with snow. It had taught drifters to herd itself when it needed herding, and it had learned hush so it could sleep when it needed to dream. Lixa leaned into the pillar as if into a chest. "We will steward you," she said softly in Telari. Winter did not end. Winter never ends. It only negotiates. But it softened at the edges when Lixa went out with her spear and her hush, and Kellen walked at her shoulder with his stubborn shovel and his coil. The drifters learned to taste around the hill instead of through it. Osk's rods learned to sing and not scream. Felon Ark learned to keep her notebook tucked inside her coat, and her hands where the wind could not scold them. They installed a beacon that didn't shout for rescue, but hummed a lesson: stewardship in progress. Bring tea. Bring patience. Bring a willingness to be wrong. A courier sled came once with a parcel for Kellen containing a demand for fees and a very nice scarf. He paid the fees with a photograph of Lixa standing on the hill at dawn and a measured line of language that made an accountant cry in relief. He wore the scarf until Lixa stole it and wrapped her tail in it because it looks like arrogance, and I like to feel dressed. They laughed often. They fought sometimes. They apologized in the languages of their hands and in the mathematics of shared work. Spring, when it came in earnest, did not announce itself with banners. It arrived as a subtle subtraction of cruelty. The vents breathed warmer. The bone under the ice sweated. On a day when the valley smelled like iron and possibility, the easy plate in the ring opened before anyone knocked. Lixa and Kellen stood at the top of the stair, hands stained with resin, hair full of sparks. Osk leaned in the hatch with her palms tucked into her armpits. Felon Ark balanced between awe and inventory. The pillar glowed brighter than it ever had. "What does it want?" Kellen asked. Lixa cocked her head, eyes half-lidded, listening the way she did when the wind wanted to teach her arithmetic. "It wants to walk," she said. "Not away, through." They went down. The throat wasn't dark. It was full of a light that felt like water's memory of sun. The pillar shifted and revealed a corridor that had been a rumor in the map for weeks. It led not deeper but truer, hugging the hill's heart until it spilled them onto a ledge inside a cavern where ice hung in blown glass chandeliers and water ran like old prayers. At the cavern's center rose a tower of the same black glass, taller than a flyer, humming like a library. Lixa reached for Kellen's hand without looking, and found it where she knew it would be. They walked forward together. "Report?" Osk called, because even in awe there are jobs. Lixa laughed, bright and fox quick. "Later," she said. "First we listen." They listened. And the hill spoke. Summer on the ice world arrived like a rumor you could drink. The vents breathed warm. The bone shelves sweated. In the cavern, the tall black tower purred through new diagnostics that sounded like rain on tin. Kellen and Lixa were mid-check when the rods on the ridge began to whine. Not the old panicked scream, but a thin, glassy keen that set their teeth on edge. "Frequency drift," Kellen said, already moving. "Something's leaning on the net." They broke into the light. Osk waved them up with 2 fingers and a face that said bad news, short fuse. Beyond the perimeter, drifters massed, dozens, keeping perfect distance as if an invisible wall leashed them. Their masks had regrown with deliberate grooves, sound channels. They learned the hush, Lixa breathed. One stepped forward, tasted the air, and sang. The note wasn't danger, it was pause. Every rod clicked off as if embarrassed, then back on wrong. The hush sequence, 3, 5, hold, reflected, inverted, fed back through the line and down into the hill like ice water poured on a fever. Kellen felt the pillar flinch under his boots. "Cut the net," he barked. Osk didn't argue. She knifed the master with a single chop. Silence fell, clean, sudden, vast. The drifters didn't advance. They held their neat half-moon and watched the hill breathe. Lixa's ears tilted, her pupils thin gold slits. "They're waiting for us to fix our own mistake." Kellen nodded, throat tight. "Then we fix it fast." To the throat, down into the pillar's glow. Inside, the air felt wrong. Too still, like a held breath begging permission. The tower in the cavern pulsed an unhappy violet. Across its face spilled a lattice of symbols they'd learned to read, like weather, buffer flooded, safeguard engaged, manual confirmation required. "Manual," Kellen said, finding the panel he'd sworn he'd never need. "Of course." Lixa slid into place at his shoulder, heat a calm river against his skin. "Tell me where to press." "Here, and here. Long on the third. It's a handshake." She smiled, a sharp, fast flicker that steadied him. "You and your hands." They moved together, a rhythm they'd earned, 3-5 hold. Above, the drifters sang once, acknowledgement, correction, and backed off a pace. Lixa exhaled. "Lesson accepted." "Filed and stamped," Kellen agreed, and only then realized his hands were shaking. Lixa caught them in both of hers and warmed the tremor away. That night, with the hill purring and the rods relearning a kinder song, a courier sled ghosted in under low cloud, lights dimmed to respect. Felon Ark jogged a package down herself, cheeks pink with the kind of pride you get when the job stops chewing and starts listening. "For you," she told Lixa, which startled everyone, including Felon. Lixa turned the envelope in her hands like a strange shell. The script was Telari, a formal, spiky hand. She read the first line in silence, then again in a whisper, then sat because knees are unreliable when history changes shape. "What does it say?" Kellen asked softly. Lixa swallowed. "It says, Winter's corrector, daughter of the Fifth River, our calendar was too proud. Your exile is rescinded. If you wish to return, the doors we closed will be opened by the ones who closed them." She huffed a laugh that wasn't laughter and blinked very hard. "It also says, bring instructions." Osk's mouth curved. Someone filed a better season. Kellen squeezed Lixa's hand. "We knew you were right. Now your world remembers." Lixa looked from the hill's mouth to the horizon that held the past in one paw and the next adventure in the other. Her tail twitched, thinking, measuring. "I don't want to go back," she said. And then, after a beat that turned the air to glass, "I want to go forward with this." When Roanoke returned, Envoy Han listened to the drift of the new net, inspected the reset logs, and read the rescindment with eyes that went faintly bright at the edges. "Stewardship permanent," she said, stamping digital wax on a document that felt heavy even in the air. To Lixa Kest, resident, and Kellen Ward, courier. Captain Osk's charter amended again, support contract formalized, salvage obligations converted to maintenance credits, profit index to ecological resilience metrics. Osk arched a brow. "Meaning I get paid for not breaking things?" "Meaning you get paid for fixing what other people break," Han said. "We are updating the region's incentives." Felon Ark actually clapped, then hid her hands in her coat, mortified. Lixa's grin showed unabashed canines. Kellen bowed to the pillar because sometimes you bow to old things that have taught you how not to be foolish. "Ellipses," Han added, a rare thread of humor warming the word. "Reports with them are permitted. Poetry, not recommended." "We'll file sonnets in the margins," Kellen said solemnly. "Denied," Han said, equally solemn, and they both almost smiled. They could have left. Once the valley learned to hum without flinching, and the drifters adopted their summer migration path like a hymn, once Osk's crew set up weather posts instead of fences and started naming storms instead of fearing them, once the hill opened a second and a third easy door, because trust breeds comfort, once all that held they could have handed over, trained up, and gone. Instead, they built a school, Not a building. Those came later when the wind agreed, but a practice. Lixa mapped the hush on palms and taught the release that undid it. Kellen taught listening with machines until the machines taught listening back. Osk taught triage with a voice like gravel and a gaze that said don't lie to yourself. Felon taught auditors to buy warmer gloves and to use them to carry tea. Pilots came. Winter farmers came. A small scattering of Tailari with careful eyes and open, empty hands came, and Lixa met them not as a returnee, but as a resident introducing new friends to an old neighbor. Envoy Han visited twice a year and left with reports that were clean enough to frame and arguments that were vigorous enough to keep the office honest. Kellen and Lixa argued, too, about coil layouts, about patrol routes, about whether the tea should be steeped 3 minutes or 4. They apologized in the language they'd invented together, shared work, warm hands, a tail laid across a knee while a diagram became less wrong. On the 100th day since the tower's first hello, the valley's lichen blushed a stubborn green, and the vents breathed a vapor that smelled faintly like copper and wet stone. Folks gathered on the hill's lip, crew, students, drifters in their way, watching without pretending to be tame. Envoy Han stood with a seal in one hand, Osk with her cap under her arm, Felon with ink on her fingers from writing a guidance document that refused to sit still, Kellen with a cable tie between his teeth. Lixa looked at Kellen, and Kellen looked at the pillar, and the pillar warmed as if amused. Lixa spoke in Tailari and then in the trader's tongue so the wind could carry both. Fox Hearth, she said, because the hill carries summer for winter, and because home is where you tend the fire so others can learn its shape. Han stamped the name with a quiet, irreversible click. The relay sang it once and again. The drifters hummed it back in a low, rolling chord that felt like a long breath finally exhaled. Kellen leaned in until Lix's shoulder touched his. "Steward," he murmured. "Hinge," she answered, teasing. "Door," he returned. She laughed, bright and sure. Both. Years later, travelers still told the story of a mouth in the ice that speaks, and a fox-eared woman who taught Winter how to listen. They told of a hard-luck courier who flirted with radios until they blushed, and a salvage captain who learned to profit off restraint. They told of an envoy with rain-colored eyes, of an auditor who grew calluses and a smile, of drifters who became shepherds, of Hush and its kinder twin, Release. Foxhearth kept their footprints the way old books keep margin notes, not to hoard them but to remind the next reader where the text bites and where it sings. In spring, the lichen wrote cursive on the stones. In winter, the pillar told jokes in pictures only the patient understood. On long nights, by the brazier's low heart, Kellen would write a letter he never sent to a council he had never met, and Lixa would tuck a tail across his knees and read over his shoulder, the hairs along her jaw lit in amber. Resident Lixa Kest, steward, Winter's corrector. Courier Kellen Ward, co-steward, hinge, door. Foxhearth, artifact, alive. Outside, the vents breathed. The hill remembered. The stars kept their knives sheathed, for now. And inside the warm ring of the world they tended into sense, two people kept doing the simplest hard thing, listening.